The only thing I really enjoy about this process is signing it. The rest of it is arduous and irksome, so when people say you must get great pleasure from doing this, they're wrong.
Then why do you do it?
A compulsion.
Humphrey Price Jones. He's a wildlife artist, a farmer, and an environmentalist. He's also caretaker for very special creatures, 2 injured wedge-tailed eagles. Hello, and welcome to RN's Off Track. I'm Anne Jones, and we're in the hills of the southern tablelands of New South Wales. The crisp, cold autumn air and the long shadows have tricked the magpies into thinking it's dawn, then dusk, all day, without break. They're practising their carols throughout. And then a peacock walks past. We're in the gardens near the farmhouse, the opposite side to the sheds, standing next to aviaries. 2 great feathered souls glare back at us from under their brow ridges. Nervous at the presence of an unknown human, they move their great weight around the cage, never quite spreading their wings to fly. Instead, they pace and jump and rumble from side to side. This species of bird, the wedge-tailed eagle, has been the focus of a long-term obsession of Humphrey Price Jones.
A wedge-tail is easily identified even by people who only have a passing interest in birds. They're very large. They do have a wedge-shaped tail. They appear as a very large, dark bird, usually gliding or soaring, with wings held slightly above the plane of the body. They're the largest bird of prey in Australia. I think they're the most magnificent example of an aquila eagle. They're a very large, lanky eagle with a very large wingspan and very deep-set eyes under protruding brows, and they have a larger beak than any other aquila eagle, so they are particularly dramatic species. And it's a species that Australia should be proud of. Occasionally people bring me eagles that are injured, and the 2 that I have in my care at the moment were probably road victims, because wedge-tails occasionally are hit by cars because they are attracted to roads by other roadkill. They can't be released because they're too badly injured, so consequently they're used by me as artist models, because first and foremost I'm a wildlife artist and specialise in birds of prey, and in particular I specialise in wedge-tailed eagles and peregrine falcons.
Could you describe how these injured birds move?
Well, they move relatively freely. Unfortunately, they can't fly, or they can't fly any great distance. As we've been observing, one of them has been putting on a fairly convincing threat display by raising the hackles on the nape of his neck and making himself look as big and as powerful as he possibly can. Of course, he is not he's not a particularly bold bird, in so much as he was never going to attack us, but he wanted to show us that he was really big and tough, and put on a fairly convincing display. I suppose one could call them fairly lazy birds. They get up late, they go to bed early, and if weather conditions aren't to their liking, they don't get up at all. In other words, they stay in the roost all day. Wedge-tails can be rather playful, so sometimes they will move about and occupy themselves by tossing things in the air and generally interacting in that way. But most of the time they sit quietly and wait to be fed. Now, because eagles can eat a significant amount of food at one sitting. One doesn't have to feed them every day. And in fact, a really healthy wedge-tail can probably go for weeks without any food.
And what do you feed them?
Principally on rabbits and hares, but they're also fed on roadkill as well, so they have a variety of foods, and very occasionally dead lambs.
Seeing as we just had a herd of ducks marauding through the middle of the interview, I think we must mention the fact that these eagles are not your only birds.
No, they're not. We have a selection of birds, and including these ducks, and we also have various other injured birds passing through, plus the ubiquitous chooks, guinea fowl, peafowl, pigeons,
wood ducks,
parrots, and others.
So I'm taking it it's a non-cat household?
Yes, it's a non-cat household. Wedge-tailed eagle population can be divided into three groups. There are happily married couples that occupy a territory all the year round. They usually have 3 or 4 nests, which they may use in rotation, but they tend to have a nest which is special to them that they use most frequently. And then there are groups of wedge-tails, and when you see large groups of wedge-tails feeding on a carcass, they are immature wedge-tails that wander around the place. And then there's a third group, commonly known as drifters, and they are adult wedge-tails living solitary existences, searching for a territory, an unoccupied territory, which they can take control of. Generally, wedge-tails are not terribly aggressive toward each other, and so the drifters will wait until territory is unoccupied, or that one of the birds within that territory, one of the mated pair, dies, in which case they would take over the role of the bird that's died. Wedge-tails mate for life. Generally speaking, they mate for life, but rather like human beings, some of them get fed up and wander off to find another partner.
Is it known how long the drifters drift?
The answer to that is no, but it would depend upon the availability of territories that fall vacant.
So it's potentially foreseeable, if the population was strong, that there could be individuals that drift their whole lifespan?
Yes, that's very possible. If the population was stable, and then that could quite well be the case. So that that's quite like the human population as well. Until quite recently, I had a pair of wedge-tails that were both old birds, and one in particular, a female, had been hatched in Melbourne Zoo. She was 57 years old when she died, and that was 2 or 3 years ago. She also had a male partner who was almost as old. The female had a rather checkered existence because she had been, as I mentioned, hatched in Melbourne Zoo, and then went through a number of institutions. The CSIRO kept her and used her for eyesight studies for a period of time. Eventually, she was in the care of Penny Olsen, who's a raptor specialist. When Penny moved from a rural property into Canberra, I inherited those 2 birds. They can become, if not genuinely tame, they can become well trained and seem to form attachments to individual humans, so that they're quite personable to that extent.
The birds you've had in the past, the pair, did they form an attachment to you?
Yes, they did. The female in particular became extremely tame when she was given to me, and remained so, and was relatively gentle. The male was tended to be unpredictable and protective of the female. She used to lay eggs each year because we erected a nesting platform for them. But the eggs, probably due to her advanced years, the eggs were always infertile.
Humphrey Pryce-Jones is a trained artist with about 40 years' experience in keeping wedge-tailed eagles. He lives and works on a farm out past Goulburn in the central tablelands of New South Wales. But wedge-tails, they're found almost all over Australia, from the desert to farmland. They're our biggest raptor. You might have seen one. They have a huge 2.5 metre wingspan, and when they fly overhead, you can see the wedge tail, sort of a diamond shape in the sky. They've got these long, feathery legs, and they gangly get about when they're on the ground. It's like they've put on a pair of low-slung feathered jeans, slightly too big around the waist and too short at the ankle. They've got no belt on, and they uncomfortably stick their legs out and raise up onto their toes as they walk in an attempt to not let the damn thing slip down. But in contrast, when they're in the sky, high enough to look like small, dark planes pulling away from the earth, they fill me with a sense of well-being and awe. And I know that I'm not alone in that. Humphrey Pryce-Jones is the same, and even more so. He's keeping 2 eagles at the moment, both males, one of about 2 years and one who is around 6 or 7. They can't be rehabilitated to live in the wild. How do you think that these 2 wedge-tails here experience life?
Well, obviously, ideally, birds like wedge-tailed eagles should not be kept in captivity, or if they are kept in captivity, if they can be flown and flying free, is preferable to them being kept in an aviary. So this brings us to the question of whether they should be kept alive. I would argue that yes, they should be, because of the reasons I mentioned before. People can be introduced to wedge-tailed eagles and gain admiration for the species, which may make them, and hopefully will make them, more concerned about protecting the species. And obviously I use them as models, which helps me, I hope, to bring people to the realization of what magnificent creatures they are.
Over the years of observing these birds at close quarters, can you tell me whether there's a differentiation between individual personalities?
Very much so. Wedge-tailed eagles are just as different as, shall we say, dogs of the same breed would be. So some wedge-tails are relatively placid, some wedge-tails tend to be aggressive, so they each have their own individual personality. That's one of the things I attempt to do when I'm painting eagles. I don't just paint a wedge-tail as representative of the species. I try and paint an individual wedge-tail, because no 2 eagles are exactly the same, and no 2 eagles look exactly the same. So they do have their individual personalities, definitely. Birds suffer terribly at the hands of would-be artists. So I always attempt to do them justice. and I think one of the ways it pays to have an intimate knowledge of a species, it gives one, or helps one, to have the ability to paint individual characteristics rather than just purely a representative of a species.
So could you walk me through, from sort of inception to finish, the process of one of your large eagle paintings?
Yes, certainly. I think most of my paintings stem from things that I've observed. I observe an eagle on the property, whatever it may be doing, and think at the time there is a painting in that. Because I have made so many drawings of eagles and so many studies of eagles, I have an enormous amount of information already stored, and I then draw a large number of roughing out exactly what the finished painting will be, then selecting from the rough drawings one which I think is most appropriate to what I'm attempting to achieve. And then it's simply a process of labouring through the finished work and hopefully achieving something. The only thing I really enjoy about this process is signing it. Because the rest of it is arduous and irksome. So when people say you must get great pleasure from doing this, they're wrong.
Then why do you do it?
A compulsion, which I've been plagued with ever since I can remember. I've always been totally absorbed and fascinated by wildlife. As a very small child, I used to collect insects and tadpoles and frogs, but was always fascinated and captivated by birds, and particularly large birds, and in particular birds of prey that have always held a fascination for me.
I mean, do you have an explanation for that?
No, I don't think anyone has worked out exactly why some people become poets, some people become authors, other people become musicians, and some people do what I do. I don't think anybody's worked out exactly why. I think it's just the luck of the draw, or the unluck of the draw, whichever way one wants to... As I mentioned earlier, it's a compulsion, and one just tries to do the best one can. I was born in North Wales and kept birds of prey as a youth, and saw my first wedge-tailed eagle when I was reasonably young in a zoo in Britain. I moved to Australia in 1968. Obviously fascinated by seeing wedge-tails, and determined to study them and to paint them. I've been doing that ever since 1968.
They are breathtaking when they're in flight.
They are, yes.
How can you bring that to your paintings? What techniques?
Yeah, I tend to paint all my subjects life-size. And because wedge-tails are big birds, therefore the paintings are big paintings. And this is particularly true if I paint an eagle in flight, because wedge-tails have a wingspan from about 180 centimetres to more than 2 metres, so 2.5 metres in fact. So my paintings of eagles in flight are large paintings, and are determined by the size of the eagle.
These particular two birds here, what's going to happen to them in the future?
Well, all being well, they'll continue their lives as artist models. They can't be released. Zoos are not particularly enthusiastic about keeping birds of prey in captivity unless they can display them flying, and obviously these two birds can't be displayed in that way, so that hopefully they'll live as happily as possible in a large aviary.
The expected lifespan would be another 40 years perhaps?
Well, yes. What happens, which is probably, they're probably going to outlive me, So they're going to be somebody else's responsibility. Yes, that's my only reason for breeding.
Someone's got to look after the bird collection. That when you were a child, you said that you went out and observed and caught insects and did all of those things, but did you go through that destructive boy phase where perhaps you had a phase of destructing nature?
Not particularly, although I've always been a hunter. Not for the sake of killing things, it's just another way one forms a close relationship with wildlife, and consequently I grew up shooting rabbits, shooting hares, shooting foxes in North Wales, and I became a consummate poacher of pheasants from the local English-owned estate, and spent quite a lot of time avoiding gamekeepers. I also illegally fished trout and salmon from local rivers, and this was all part of being a Welsh youth interested in wildlife. And I still shoot rabbits and still shoot foxes. So that I've always done that.
What are the threats that these birds face?
Well, most eagle deaths are at the hands of people, either directly or indirectly. So eagles fly into power lines. Over the years, I've picked up more than half a dozen eagles that have been, my attention's been brought to them, and they've flown into power lines, some of which have been released, others too badly injured and had to be put down. More recently, wind turbines pose a significant hazard to wedge-tailed eagles, because hunting eagles tend to occupy the same airspace as the blades of turbines, and they're really not something that eagles are used to coping with. So the tips of blades moving at 160, 180 kilometres an hour, appearing from nowhere as far as the eagle is concerned, and occupying the same airspace as a hunting eagle, poses a significant threat. Now, wedge-tails aren't an endangered species, but locally, wedge-tails, the local population of wedge-tails can become endangered, and wind turbine developers will say, oh well, more eagles are killed by traffic on roads than by turbines. That may, in some cases, be true, but that's not any justification for killing more of them.
What obligation do you have to the birds in a broader sense?
Well, I attempt through my work to bring people's attention to the richness of Australian bird life, and that it should be considered to be a very, very important part of the Australian environment. Wedge-tails have this very individualistic way of soaring, gliding, and flapping. I mean, their flapping flight is rather heavy and looks rather laborious, a bit like a heron, in fact, its wing beats. But as soon as it glides and starts to soar, it assumes a majesty that is peculiar to the species, with the wings held slightly above the plane of the body. And if it's gliding, it rocks slightly from side to side. Although I see soaring wedge-tails on an almost daily basis, one never becomes accustomed to that sight. It's something that one never gets over. It's something that is always inspiring and sometimes quite awe-inspiring. Humphrey
Price Jones, wildlife artist and environmental activist. a man drawn towards wildlife, compelled to open his heart to it, and his home too. Of course, not just anyone can keep raptors in New South Wales. There are permits and checks to ensure that the qualifications and lodgings are adequate. But anyone can witness the majesty of the wedge-tailed eagle if you're just lucky enough to see one around. I'd love to hear your observations and stories, or see your photos. You can find me on Twitter at Jones_Anne, or over at the Off Track website. Go to abc.net.au/RN and follow the prompts. On the drive home from the farm, I kept my eyes peeled for a wild eagle, and it was only at the last moments of light when the rays that spray golden lines across the top of the trees suddenly hit a dark figure. A huge bird, head smooth, beak menacing, shoulders bulky against the sky, surveying its territory. It was standing like Batman would stand on the top of a building, chest out, frown firmly in place, as if he owns the place. And he does. Just a quick trip into wedge-tailed eagle territory this time on Off Track. I'm Anne Jones, and next week I'll take you somewhere else.